and Ed is going to give a presentation tonight on the Allegheny River Islands, which Ed and I and a couple of other researchers have been, over the last few years, have been taking a look at some neat islands on the Allegheny River and documenting some of the interesting things that we found. So, you ready, Ed?
Yep.
All right. Thank you.
All right. As Dale says, there's been basically 4 of us doing research up in the Allegheny River, from the stretch from Buckaloons down to just below Tionestas, where we focused most of our efforts so far. And that's the area where this talk covers. And this is called Trees and Forests, the Allegheny River Islands Wilderness and Nearby Islands. This is an interim report through December of 2011. We're going to continue to explore more up there and add more reports as time passes. But I wanted to pull together all the stuff we managed to compile in the meantime. It's available with photographs, charts, graphs for download from our Native Tree Society website. As Dale said, we're involved with the Native Tree Society. It used to be called the Eastern Native Tree Society, but we've expanded in some other areas outside the core pockets of eastern United States. We're a cyberspace interest group devoted to documentation, the celebration of trees and forests of North America and around the world through art, poetry, mythology, science, medicine, woodcrafts, and collecting research data for a variety of purposes. The NTS provides a discussion forum for people who view trees and forests not just as a crop to be harvested, but also something of value in their own right. Even today, we're finding the largest, oldest trees ever recorded for some species. We're finding hidden pockets of old-growth forests and examples of unusual forest ecosystems. We do all this. One of our main focuses is on measuring trees accurately, how big they are, how tall they are. Because basically, the data that's out there about how big trees are is pretty bad. It's really bad. You see descriptions of, like, when you see in old literature, all white pines grew to 240 feet tall. Well, probably they never did. But all the data you have out there for tree height measurements is all bad. All of it. 100% of it bad. Except for what we're measuring with our instruments. We use a laser rangefinder and measure this distance. We measure this angle here. And then this height is the sine of the angle times this distance. Do that same for the top and same for the bottom. Add the two together, you get an accurate height. And the laser rangefinder lets us explore the tree top, find what top's actually the tallest. Other methods, you shoot some base and measure the distance. Well, if the top isn't over the top of the tree, your reading's going to be wrong. And so you get accuracies, typical errors of 10 to 20 feet in tree heights. Our measurements are typically less than a foot an error, generally in the 1 or 2 inches range. So you need that type of accuracy to do any type of detailed scientific research or modeling. So that's what our group's about. Now, we're looking at the Allegheny River. This is the Allegheny River Basin. Here's where it flows from Pennsylvania up into New York, past Olean, back down through Warren. And our area of research is concentrated from basically here down to here, this little stretch here. Within this area is the Allegheny River Island Wilderness, which is the initial focus. Kinzig Dam is located in Allegheny River in Warren County, 198 miles where it flows into the Monongahela to form the Ohio River. Drainage basin in Conewango Creek, which flows into Warren, is 896 square miles. Broken Straw Creek, which flows in at Buckaloons Recreation Area south of there, about 7 miles farther south, is 338 square miles. And the next biggest drainage down along here is where Tionesta Creek flows into it along the eastern side of it. And it has a watershed of 480 square miles. There's smaller watersheds in there, but they basically just drain directly into the Allegheny River without having any substantial watersheds of their own. Now, why this particular area? Well, this is what's the Allegheny River Island Wilderness. It's the Forest Service smallest wilderness area in their entire system. There are smaller wilderness areas, but they're not maintained by the Forest Service. The uppermost island is Crull's Island. Buckaloons Recreation Area is there. Crull's, Thompson, R. Thompson, Courson, King, Baker, and No Name Island. And so it's nice to look at an area that's not being constantly harvested or farmed in order to get some idea of what the potential for growth is along these trees in the forest. Specifics about Crull Island, it's the largest, 96 acres. As the large, described in their leaflets, have large old river bottom trees. About 2/3 of the island was farmed back in the 1800s. A major flood in about 1865 wiped out the buildings that were on it, and it's been no habitation since, some grazing up into the 1930s on the island. Thompson Island is the second biggest one. The only Revolutionary War battle in northwestern Pennsylvania occurred on this island. I might mention that a bit later. R. Thompson, a small island. Coursen Island, this is right by Tidiu, you can see it. King Island, Baker Island, which is north of Tionesta, and No Name Island. Altogether, there's a couple hundred acres of forest here that's part of this wilderness.
Is there any wildlife in those forests, or is it pretty much just like the trees and
There's
vegetation?
trees, there's rabbits, you get deer coming across the island. We've chased out a number of deer, a variety of bird species. What you'd typically expect on it. In the summertime, the river's quite low and there's not really a big barrier for migration between the islands for the larger game animals. Now, Buckaloons Recreation Area along the Allegheny River. This is where Broken Straw Creek flows into it, right here. And this is the campgrounds up at Buckaloons National Recreation Area. And it's interesting that if you look here on this map here, this is from like around 2000, 2002. You see all this nice wooded stuff in amongst the campgrounds. Back in air photos from about 1930, this is basically all fields. And you just had a little band of trees along here and a little band of trees along the riverbank. The rest of it was trees. Now, there was a series of Indian villages along the Allegheny River. One of them was located at Buckaloons, and actually the French had a trading post established there in the late 1700s. Here's a description of them from, this isn't at Buckaloons, but comparable to what's several other villages that were up there. Immediately after reaching a high hill, we discovered the Allegheny River and a number of cornfields descending several towns which the enemy had deserted on approach of the troops, the enemy meaning the Native Americans. Some of them fled just before the advance guard reached the towns and left several packs of deer skins. At the upper Seneca towns, we found a painted image or war post clothed in dog skin, and John Montour told me this town was called Yagarum Wago, whatever it is. Besides this, we found several other towns consisting whole of 130 houses, some of which were large enough for accommodation of 3 or 4 Indian families in their entirety. The troops remained on the ground there 3 whole days, destroying towns and cornfields. I never saw finer corn, although it was planted much thicker than is common with our farmers. This quantity of corn and other vegetables destroyed the several towns, from best accounts I can collect, and the officer employees to destroy it must certainly have exceeded 500 acres, which is the lowest estimate, and plunders taken is estimated at $30,000. I've directed a sale to be made of it for the troops. This is a report made by Colonel Broadhead in 1779. At the time, we're undergoing the Revolutionary War, and some of the Indians had allied themselves with the British, and the British would send them loose to raise the settlers that were supporting of the American cause. And so Colonel Broadhead had been petitioning General Washington for a long time to send a expeditionary force up the river to deal with these savages who were destroying the villages. And finally in 1779 he did. And there's a nice account, full account of it referenced in my book here, but he has like a 5-page report of the whole effort that he sent to General Washington that you can find in a book called Schenck's History of Warren County from 1886. Now, this was a site that was part of the Seneca village, and they did excavations here. You can see they found a whole bunch of things. These hexagonal squares here are the village at the time that Brodhead raided the place. These big hexes, 17th century villages. The smaller little triangles are campsites or small individual structures. These round ones are Hopewell Indian mounds. Hopewell culture extended down into the Ohio River Valley, and they commonly had burial mounds of small size in most places. You get down into like Cahokia and stuff, they're enormous things that rival the pyramids in size for burial mounds. And their smaller ones were found right in this area of Broken Straw Creek. Here's Anders Run Oak Site. They found 430-year-old oak trees at that site. There's been a lot of talk, you might see, about how the Indians would burn the forest and to replenish the ground, and they're major effectors of the natural environment at the time. So it wasn't just a pristine thing like everyone says. They were doing major things to the forest. Well, they were, but they were doing major things to small areas of the forest. They weren't burning it wholesale or chopping it down for massive farms, or they weren't logging it. They were burning patches of forest here and there as part of their crop rotation cycle. And you can see some evidence of that burning in the release and growth spurts in the tree rings of that site, but for the most part, here it is. A village has been there for hundreds of thousands of years, and there's 435-year-old oak trees right by it, within spitting distance. So it wasn't like they're making major effects on the overall land structure of the entire area. All right, we put in at Broken Straw Creek and sailed down the river. This is the upper end of Crull's Island. It's the first and largest of the islands, the Allegheny River Island Wilderness. It's 96 acres in size. This particular picture is taken in the spring. You can see even after the construction of Kinzua Dam, the upper end of the island would tend to flood. Prior to the construction of Kinzua Dam, the river would flood massively in the spring, and the summer basically go down to a trickle. The Kinzua Dam has regulated the flow, so the floods in the spring aren't as massive, and they've got more flow in the summer. So it sort of smoothed it out. And that has some deleterious effects on the ecosystem of these islands, but there's not really much you can do about it now that the dam's been built, and people build up so heavily right along the floodplain of the river. Like, you couldn't go back and reflood it periodically because you'd wipe out all those people's houses and camps and everything. This was an early report about the island, Broken Straw Island. A guy named Babbitt wrote a guidebook from all the way up above Warren, all the way down to Pittsburgh, of all the islands and places that were visited. And this is the first one. This is what's called Crull's Island, and it's called Broken Straw in his report in 1855. Here we have channel to the right. The island is about 3/4 of a mile long and contains 63 acres of cultivated land. This is Broken Straw Creek, Buckaloons. Right here is where Anders Run natural area is. This is Irvin's Run, named for General Irvin, who was an early surveyor and military man who owned property along the edge of the river. It was Irvins that were farming on this island. Now, this island flooded massively in about 1860, 1862. I have to look up the date. But up to that time, most all of this whole upper part was farmed. And afterwards, after the flood, they pretty much abandoned the heavy grazing. This area here was still under cultivation up to the mid-1930s. We've got accounts from the family that talk about cultivating on this island. This is the north end, this is the south end. The river's flowing down this way. Now, Crull Island has gone some changes. This is what you see in typical river islands. This was a photograph from 1939. You see this whole area here is basically a sandbar, a little pocket right here in the middle of young silver maples and sycamore trees that are growing. By the mid-1990s, you see this area is all completely grown up. So what had been just basically bare sandbar now is grown up into trees. What had been sandbar up here at the point now is overgrown with trees. What had been a more open area here in the center is now pretty much the same, but you've still got some bigger trees in here that weren't present at the time. And looking at this, you can make a map that shows how the relationships are between different height levels along the island. This real low area is called the floodplain. It floods every summer. Right here is the Terrace, which floods a whole lot less, maybe every 10 or 20 years, and sort of a transition area in between. So where in this map do you think you'd find the oldest trees? Well, what you find is all this floodplain stuff is fairly young. So it's not there. You can see a lot of it's just bare ground back in 1939. The Terrace stuff, up there on the flat, that was pretty much all farmed. And so all the stuff that was up there is chopped up. So the oldest trees, right along this area, are what's called this intermediate terrace. And some of those date back to the mid-1800s. Probably most all the island is completely cut bare during the initial farming utilization of the island back in the 1860s. There are some decent sized trees on here. Here's a common hackberry. This is one of our compatriots who were involved with it. This is Carl Harting. He's actually a pharmacist, but he's part of our tree measuring group. Celtis occidentalis, northern end of Crull Island, 100.5 feet tall, 11.4 feet in girth. Now we spent a lot of time on this island because Dale had visited like back in 2003, and we measured this one in 2007. At the time, Dale got 99 point some feet tall for the island for this particular hackberry, so we really pushed and pushed and pushed, trying to find that highest sprig to give Dale his 100-foot tall tree. And so eventually we did. Black maple. Black maple looks pretty much like sugar maple. There's some difference in the bark characteristics. The leaves are thicker, the buds are darker. It's kind of hard to distinguish one from the other. We went back and forth on whether it's both black maple and sugar maple, or just sugar maple, and in the end, we decided there was both black maple and sugar maple based on characteristics that we had to keep checking back to see the buds at the proper stage and see the leaves and all that to finally make the determination. So there's a nice stand of black maple on the island. This is the northern end. Well, Dale and Tony and Carl would run around looking at the big trees. I try to concentrate on some of the smaller trees, get what's the biggest of the small trees on the island. Try to look at what of the diversity of species on the island. This is a Mussel Wood, and it's a really nice little specimen. It's almost 3 feet in circumference, and I think it goes 40 feet tall. And it's got a nice form, a decent spread, and so while a lot of them are looking at sycamore after sycamore trying to find the tallest one, I kind of concentrate on little trees. If we want to understand the ecosystem of an island or an island system, you can't just look at the biggest things there. You have to look at a broader spectrum of what's growing on the island. What's happened in that terraced area that was farmed? Well, they abandoned it in the mid-1930s. In the meantime, this is after winter. This is reed canary grass. It's an invasive species. And basically, it almost crowds everything else out. It grows as a monoculture and crowds everything out. And massive areas of several of these islands are covered by reed canary grass. Here in the background, these are hawthorns, probably a few bitternut hickories, and some grapevines. You think about wilderness and being like this pristine area, that's never been touched. Well, a lot of our wilderness areas are areas that were affected. We just haven't done anything with them since they've been declared wilderness. And so they're still undergoing changes that are brought on from past activities or influences from outside the boundaries of the wilderness areas. So this area is still being affected by the past farming processes, and a lot of these islands are being terribly overrun by various types of invasive species. This is one of the major species on reed canary grass. I mentioned grapevines. Here's a really nice fat grapevine. Vitus, I don't know what species it is, just some species of grapevine, and it's growing in a little grove of apple trees. You always get intermixed apples and hawthorns in these abandoned sites. Whenever there's apple trees, there's always hawthorns right nearby. They seem to have a nice relationship with each other. How many white pines do you think are found in the Allegheny River Islands Wilderness? There's 7 full islands wilderness, and any guesses how many white pine trees? You look around here, they're all over the place. You see the Seneca Pine up here at Cook's Forest is 184 feet tall. You have dozens that are over 160 feet tall. Any guesses? Come on, someone say
1,000.
1,000. Good guess. See, she's closer than the rest of you. Rest you just chicken. There are two. There are 2 pine trees in all of the Allegheny River Island Wilderness. Both of them are at the lower, higher end of Crull's Island. I think that probably the white pine doesn't survive being transported by water to the island very easily, so it's hard to get it reestablished. And it's on one of the higher points in the island, and it suggests that maybe the pines don't really like being flooded all that much. We found some on some of the other islands that are privately owned, but within the Allegheny River Island Wilderness, there are this one and this one are the only 2 white pines we found in all 7 islands that we explored. Continuing downstream another couple miles, you come to Thompson's Island. For the most part, these 1855 maps are pretty good. With this one, he's sort of gotten this a lot fatter and shorter than it is in reality. This is an air photo, but he does have the separate little island up here at the top. During times of high flow, this is a separate island. When the water's low, this is just a dry channel between them. This little patch here probably corresponds to this little patch right here. Now, Thompson Island is another island with an awful lot of neat species in it. We found an old slippery elm, almost rubra, on Thompson Island. This is a really impressive old specimen. You see the bark's all rough and gnarly. Up here at the top, you see the top's been broken off. You've got these big, fat, thick branches sticking out to the side. Think about it, if you're a tree and you've got your head stuck up in the air for 100 years or 200 years, you're going to be exposed to an awful lot of wind. And what happens is you get a nice tree up there, oh, it's big, well, is that tree old? Well, if the branches are nice and intact and look real pretty, it's not an old tree, because if you're stuck up there in the weather for 200 years, you're going to get branches broken off, and you're going to get these big, thick, broken, massive limbs on it. That's one of the signs of an old growth tree and an old tree. We don't know how old it is, we didn't core it, but just from the physical characteristics, you can tell it's one of the older trees that we've come across. Yeah, another major invasive species is Japanese knotweed. You see these all over the place in fields around here, along roads. The entire southern half of Thompson Island is completely covered with Japanese knotweed, and it's severely affected a lot of the other islands. You walk up here, and this stuff is 12 feet tall. And you can just hear the bees buzzing bzzz, as you walk up there, because there's just such a massive amount of them there. There are big trees back in here that we couldn't get to on this first trip, because there's just no way to work through the knotweed. We came back one spring and actually found some neat stuff, but they were in trees that we couldn't actually physically reach because of the massive amounts of Japanese knotweed in the fall on our first trip. This is one here. This is a multi-trunk silver maple. This is 26 feet around if you wrap all the trunks together. There's 7 distinct trunks there, and it's like 115 feet tall. So it's not real tall, but it's a nice big chunk of wood. And this was buried in amongst the Japanese knotweeds, and you probably wouldn't have ever got to it, except there's like a swale where the stream would wash down through the middle of it. We were able to walk down the swale where the Japanese knotweed wasn't present and see this tree about 20 feet off the path up in the bank. One of the trees hidden in amongst that knotweed is this silver maple here. Here's Dale Luthringer. You can tell what he looks like. You know, there he is right here. This is a tree that's 128.9 feet tall. I found it. It wasn't Dale, so I'm going to take all the credit. No matter what he says, I found it. We're walking along there, and I was measuring trees, and says, "What are you measuring, that sycamore?" He says, "No, that tall silver maple." And we both measured. I got like 128.9, Dale got 128.8. You know, we were in a tenth of a foot of each other, independent measurements from independent instruments. And this was one that the knotweed would have been up to here, and you would have no way to guess how far the bottom of the tree actually reached because it was buried in massive knotweed. In the United States, the only silver maples we know that are over 120 feet tall are found within this stretch of the Allegheny River. There aren't any more. You know, we don't have any in our database that's taller than 120 feet. But here, you've got this one here, we've got several more in the 120 plus feet on some of the islands. You've got them along what we call the King Peninsula, which is an attached area, a sandbar along the shore of King Island near Tionesta. That was the former tallest. We found this one. So the hot spot for tall silver maples, as far as we know, is right in along the upper Allegheny River. There isn't anywhere else, and they've actually looked at quite a few of them, you know, in Ohio, up in New England, and we have the biggest. Now I was saying about the Japanese reed canary grass spreading out. What it's doing up in Crull Island is actually spreading out into what's left of the Terrace forest and the Middle Terrace forest, and growing over everything. You're not getting any reproduction of any of the native species there because it's just being overwhelmed by the canary reedgrass. Just like you're not getting reproduction in amongst the sycamores and silver maples on Thompson Island, other islands, because it's being overwhelmed by the Japanese knotweed. Here's an example of reed canary grass on Thompson Island, and here's a hawthorn. What do you see here? You see a nice green patch underneath the hawthorn. Now this is in the spring, before there's any real leaves, so it's not an effective shade. What I believe this to be is an effect of what's called chemical allelopathy. Plants give off chemicals to like fight each other for territory, for nutrients, and for water. And I think the hawthorns are excreting something from the roots that's killing off the knotweed, so you get a different species of grass growing underneath them than besides the reed canary grass growing all along. Now, I've talked to the guy who wrote the report on Crull Island, which showed you those terraces of different ages and the old photographs, and he thought that these hawthorns were present in the older photographs and have just gotten bigger over time. But as I look at the air photographs, what I seem to see is that the hawthorns are actually encroaching into the reed canary grass. And so I think they're the one native species that's being able to overtake the reed canary grass and actually gain some foothold against it. And that's because of this chemical allelopathy. There wouldn't be any real way to tell. You'd have to do a whole series of cores, and you have to get special permission to do that because it's a wilderness area. But it might be something interesting just to see if it's happening. Talked about the Revolutionary War battle in northwestern Pennsylvania. Here's an account of it from Colonel Broadhead. At 10 miles on this side of the town, one of the advance guards consisting of 15 white men, including the spies, and 8 Delaware Indians, under the command of Lieutenant Harting of the 8th Pennsylvania Regiment, whom I have before recommended to your excellency for his great bravery and skill as a partisan, discovered between 30 and 40 warriors coming down the Allegheny River in 7 canoes. The warriors, having likewise discovered some of the troops, immediately landed, stripped off their shirts, and prepared for action. And the advance guard immediately began the attack. All the troops except one column and flankers, being in the narrows between the river and the high hill, were immediately prepared to receive the enemy, which being done, I went forward to discover the enemy and saw 6 of them retreating over the river without arms. At the same time, as the rest ran away, leaving their canoes, blankets, shirts, provisions, and 8 guns, besides 5 dead, and by signs of blood several went off wounded. Only 2 of my men and one of the Delaware Indians were wounded, and so slightly they already recovered and were fit for action again. Now this is the account of Colonel Broadhead running into a band of natives right off of Thompson Island, J. Thompson Island in the older maps. And this is his account. I was speaking to some people up at Warren a few weeks ago, and there's different versions of it. From the other side has a slightly different version of it, but he was going to send me a reference to see what the other side says about this battle. But in any case, this happened right next to Thompson Island, and it's the only Revolutionary War battle in this part of Pennsylvania. Next island down is Coursen Island. There's several small ones in there in the stretch in between. There's our Thompson Island, there's Stewart's Island, there's Millstone, and there's Fuelheart, which are the named islands in that stretch. But this is the next major island. It sits right there at Tionesta. You can see it from the bridge. You can see it from the overlook just north of Tionesta on, what is it, Route 66. Now, what I've done here is I've taken this map from Beers 1865 and compared it to an aerial photograph from 1939. What do you see here? You see there's a Church Island here. Here's McGill and McGee Island and McGuire Island. Well, McGuire Island is pretty much the same. You've got this little chunk here, which corresponds almost exactly to that. The rest of McGuire Island right here. But this has changed dramatically right here. Instead of having 2 different islands, these islands by 1939 already merged into one larger island called, Coursen Island. So this upper end section here was Church Island. This middle section right here is McGill and McGee Island. This is probably just another little sandbar that happened to form in there once these 2 islands merged together, made an eddy, and widened the island in this area. So you get an awful lot of changes in the geomorphology of the islands over time, and that affects the trees that are grown there. You can see this is open fields where things are being grown, and these darker areas are older forests at the time of 1939. You can even see farther attachment points farther upstream on the island, where islands that were once in the river now have become attached to shore. So you always need to be cognizant of what's going on history-wise as far as the island themselves. You're not going to find 200-year-old trees on a part of the island that's only 50 years old. You know, that's just not going to happen. This is from the overlook along the main highway, looking down at Courson Island. This is the lower end of that little island inlet that we just saw you. So this is a little separate piece here. This is the main island and behind here. On that little island inlet, we did find some really nice trees. Here's Carl again, with this sycamore that's 136.5 feet tall. 136.5 is a pretty impressive tree. It really is for this part of the country. And it's one of the tallest we found. Another silver maple, 123 feet tall. Like I said, there's almost no trees found. There's no silver maples I know of anywhere else in the country that's over 120 feet tall. We've got a bunch of them here. That's close up and farther away. Butternut. Here's an old butternut tree. It's 86 feet tall. Don't know how old it is. We found some older looking specimens, but I don't have any good photographs of them. This is the tallest we found in the island. It's the largest tree that's really growing. The problem is butternut's been subject to what's called a butternut canker, and they grow so big. Basically, this canker grows around and cuts off the circulation to some of the limbs, and they fall off and die. And so it's been pretty hard hit by butternut canker. It's nice to find any specimens at all, and we found a fair amount of them actually on these islands. Now here is Coarsen Island here. This is McGuire Island. This is Tionesta. Comes around here, and you've got this whole series of smaller islands in here. Dale and Carl went visiting back in early May. They haven't written a report for me yet, but they visited them, so we got some more numbers for down there. Again, you can see some of the changes in the river. Here, you've got this nice big bend right here that probably incorporates all of this island here. At the time, it was a separate island. Now it's been incorporated as part of the shore. And you can see other islands have become free or incorporated themselves all along here. So it's a constant amount of change. Immediately below that picture is what's called Hemlock Island. This is Hemlock Island. This is a privately owned island. You can see it from the highway, and it was particularly intriguing. What's neat about it is it was high. It's a really high island. Looking across the shore, we can see these massive trees here. We can see actually hemlock trees on it. We haven't found any hemlocks on any of the other islands in the system, because hemlock's another tree that doesn't transport well across the water. There wasn't any hemlocks, but this one had hemlocks. So we eventually made a trip over to Hemlock Island. Here's a little internal runnel and nice big massive oak trees. We found the highest diversity of any island in the entire system on Hemlock Island. That's because most all the top surface of the island is so high that it almost never floods there. So it has an assemblage of trees that are basically the same as it is in the surrounding shore areas on the hills around there. Whereas the other islands sit much lower, are subject to flooding, and that limits the number of species that can grow. Another silver maple. This one was only about 116 feet tall, 119 feet tall. It's a real nice, massive silver maple. Here's in one of the lower areas. You see some species more similar to what you see in some of the flooded islands. Here's basically a fern base. These are black locust trees. And black locust is one of the species we found on most all the islands because it seems to do well in areas that are flooded. It's never a predominant one, but it's one that's always at least there in a few numbers on all the islands. Hemlock. We found a hemlock on Hemlock Island. As I said, we didn't find any on any of the other islands. It's not a giant specimen. It was less than 100 feet tall, but its presence just shows you that the ecosystem here is different because it's not subject to the continual flooding. Beech. Beech is another species. We found it on a number of the islands. We found it on both Crull and Thompson Island, but they're found in areas on the island where it's particularly taller, higher above the ground. Here we've got a whole series of beech trees, and is quite prominent ones. We found things, sassafras, we found scarlet oak, black oak. On the other islands we found some red oaks, and that's about the only oak species we found. We found white oaks, we didn't find any sassafras. Lots of species are missing. This is a silver maple. You can see it has several different trunks. This is basically in the same flat as the black locust picture from a few times earlier. What happens with silver maples, and they'll be growing there and they'll send up shoots, and then when these massive floods would come through, those shoots would get knocked over and mutilated by the ice and debris that are being carried by the floods. And so the next time they come up with two stems. And they repeat this process over and over again. You get almost typical for silver maples are these multi-trunk specimens. I think this one had 18 different stems in it from repeatedly being damaged. Some species, you get your trunk knocked off and broken down by these debris and get flooded. They just die. The silver maple just sends up a couple more shoots and keeps going. So you see a whole bunch of these multi-stem species here. When we're trying to look at our database in our Native Tree Society, trying to think about, well, we want to compare single trunk trees with single trunk trees, but we can't really ignore multi-trunk trees when in many situations multi-trunk trees are the typical or norm for that species in a particular environment. And so we're trying to have some guidelines for how to measure multi-trunk trees and keeping a separate list of some of the more massive ones of those just so we're not ignoring them. Now I said about the species diversity. This back scale, the light gray one, this is the maximum height of every single species we found in the entire river system that we've mapped. The green ones are the species we found on Hemlock Island. And you can see an awful lot of them. This whole stretch here, cucumber, northern red oak, black oak, the tallest specimens, and in many cases the only specimens of many of these species were ones that were found on Hemlock Island because it had that high and dry thing. High and dry upper terrace was much higher than the other ones. So we did this, a type of chart like this for each one of the islands, using the same background and superimposed the measurements for that particular island on top of it so you can directly compare. You can see this is just a massive amount of green. There's a few specimens that weren't, species that weren't found on Hemlock Island. But to tell the truth, Dale and I was there for one evening. We measured 100 trees, and we haven't been back since. So I'm willing to bet that almost all these species that are still gray on this picture are actually on the island. We just haven't had a return trip to find them. And I'm also willing to bet that probably the black willow, which we don't have a measurement from the island, I bet we've got a bigger black willow on Hemlock Island than we found anywhere else in any of the other islands as well. So we need some more trips back there to check out this really neat island. The next one downstream is one called Kings Island. This land up above it here is all Forest Service stuff. Here's the road. This is Forest Service. So you can walk down here, and this is just a real shallow way to cross it in summertime, knee-high stuff. In the spring, it can be flooded, over your head, but in the summertime, it's just barely get your knees wet type of wading across there to this island. This is a really complicated one. I go a lot to the geomorphology of the island in my report, but this is one of the specimens on it. Here's Anthony Kelly, one of the members of our team on the first trip, and he's standing at the base of this multi-trunk tree. Here's Dale Luthringer up here up inside of it. And this is, again, a silver maple in the center of the island that's got massive multiple stems because it's been mutilated multiple times by flooding. Dotted hawthorn. This is a dotted hawthorn tree. People look at hawthorn trees and don't think much about them. This is the national champion. I actually got finally, after like 4 years of fighting with them, I got a letter from American Forest saying, yes, you have the national champion. It's 39.3 feet tall, average crown spread of 43.5 feet, and a girth of 6.4 feet. Like I said, I focus on trying to find a lot of the little trees on the island, while a lot of the other people are looking at the big ones. And once you start looking at these hawthorns and realize that these are really enormous specimens for their species, you start seeing them everywhere. Even Dale started seeing these big hawthorns everywhere. And this is the national champion. The tallest one had been found on at Buckaloons, right in the campgrounds at campground 16, but we found one slightly taller on, I believe it was Crull Island, which is the new tallest dotted hawthorn we found anywhere. Hawthorn species are complicated to identify. After lots of back and forth and trials and tribulations, we decide these are dotted hawthorn as the best fit of the species. There are, I believe, at least 2 different species of hawthorns growing on the islands. So I'm calling this one dotted hawthorn and the other one just hawthorn species because it's physically different as far as the branch structure, but I haven't been able to see any of them in flower or fruit, in order, which is some of the keys to help identify the particular species. Oops. All right. Now I've talked about single trunk silver maples. Silver maples do get nice single trunks. Here's Carl again. You can actually fit inside of that. This is about 18 feet in diameter and 110 feet tall. Yeah, circumference. I didn't say diameter. I meant to say girth. And so this is a really massive silver maple. So if you're going to looking at trees, comparing what's the biggest tree and what isn't, you shouldn't be combining those ones that have like 20 little tiny stems this big around that's maybe 30 years old with something that's really massive and giant like this.
How old was that tree?
It's over 100.
How old is it?
We'd never know until, it came down and we tried. I don't even have an increment bore that would drill into the center. That's that long. We got one that's like 24 inches and that's almost $400.
This is another butternut, a nice specimen right in the middle of a flat area on Kings Island. And what I saw on Kings Island and some of the other islands is that you get these areas that are just massive amounts of reed canary grass or other invasive species, but in amongst them you'll see these little trees sticking up. From the distance they almost look like sumac, but you get closer you realize they're butternut. And what happened is it looks like these trees would fall over and then they'd resprout from the roots again over and over again. Whether they fell over from wind or from canker disease, get a lot of resprouting from butternut within these areas that are basically predominated by various types of invasive species.
I like that picture myself because if you look really closely, when you're out measuring trees, a lot of times you're by yourself, trying to take pictures of yourself, and sometimes it takes snapshots and catches you in action in a bad position. But it's hard to see, but I could actually see part of my thigh. I was trying to do a 50-yard dash in 10 seconds through 3-foot high grass and twigs, and right at the base of that tree I did a head plant, so it kind of snapped. You can see it's my leg. Anyway, so.
I wasn't going to mention that and embarrass Dale, but yes, that is true. Again, black locust. These are like 110 feet tall, not spectacular, but it's an indication that the species is present at this island as well. I had to hunt and hunt to find the 10th species on this. We calculate something called a Rucker Index, where we take the average height of the tallest individual of each of the tallest 10 species, like the tallest white pine, tallest hemlock, and average them together. We use that to compare between different sites with different species compositions. And the basic Rucker Index requires 10 species. And if you find 10 species, that means, well, you've hunted hard enough to get a good feel of what was in that site, so you're not just messing around and guessing things. You've actually got a fair impression of it. And it's a reflection of the overall height for the site. And this was my 10th species, and I had to really hunt to find this. I knew it was on here. I made a specific trip back to King Island with Carl for the sole purpose of measuring one of these black locusts. Because you go in there, you see this tree, we'll find a bigger one later. And then you get to the end of the day and you've never found a bigger one and you didn't measure that first one you came across. And that happens to you all the time. Baker Island. Baker Island is just north of Tionesta. And again, you can see 1855 map, 1 island, 2 islands, 3 islands here. Now these are all merged together into one larger island. Baker Island was one that was subject to a tornado in 1985. This is August 1958. You can see there's a fair amount of trees there. There's an open area where they've been doing some grazing earlier. And here's another area that's probably been doing some grazing on the island. They had a tornado in April of 1993, and basically much of the trees across this lower end of the island is blown over. This looks worse than it is because this is taken in the wintertime with the leaves off. But so it's not as barren as it appears, but you can see that there are scour areas from the massive winds that cut across there. And you can compare basically a recent air photo with the ones down there, and you can see all these trees down here are all completely gone. This area here, these trees here are all gone. Those are things that haven't regrown from the tornado in 1985. This area also is pretty massively covered by reed canary grass at the present time. Dotted hawthorn. Again, another impressive specimen of hawthorn. It's one of those neat little trees that once you start seeing it, it just grows and spreads all over the place. basswood. This tree was 85 feet tall and 10 feet in diameter. If you look up here, right here, the top of this tree was blown out by the tornado in 1985. And actually, we went back there the last time, this tree's only about this high because rot from that previous damage has made the top of this tree fall off again. So that's a tree that's right on the edge of the tornado damage area, and it's still fat, 10 feet in circumference and 85 feet tall. Sycamores have fallen over. This is kind of interesting. Sycamore has this nice mottled bark pattern, the gray, white, flaking bark. This tree's fallen over. What were branches now are growing up to form additional trunks. Now, eventually, if not in this specimen, I found other specimens where these branches will send down new roots down into the ground. Until they do that, the life on these limbs are being supported by the tenuous connection to the roots down here at the other end flowing through this bark. But eventually, if they manage to survive long enough, they'll have to send down roots and send up new trunks and complete trees that are all grown together in this basically a clonal colony from the fallen limbs. Black willow does this a lot of times. It falls over, sends up new shoots. It's a common waterside species. Here's Dale trying to push the tree back up to where it's supposed to be. On Baker Island, where right by the tornado damage area, we found this sycamore. There's me, you can tell because it's handsome. That's me. This tree is 148.3 feet tall. This is the tallest tree found in the Allegheny River Island Wilderness. And for a while there, it was the tallest in the Northeast, but we've since found some that are like 151. So this is one of the tallest trees, deciduous trees in northeastern United States.
So is the sycamore tree the tallest?
The tallest tree in northeastern United States is the Seneca Pine down here on the Longfell Trail. I mean the Longfell Pine on the Longfell Trail at 184 feet tall. The tallest tree in eastern United States is a tulip poplar down in the Great Smokies at 190, almost 192 feet tall. There had been an accurate measurement with cross-triangulation and surveying equipment of a pine down there called the Boogerman Pine at 207 feet, white pine, but its top blew off and it's down to like 187, 188, but it's growing. The tallest in the world is 383 feet tall, a coastal redwood out in California. And Jebediah Redwoods State Park. Now this is Baker Island here. And this little island here is the last one that's part of the Allegheny River Island Wilderness. It's called No Name Island. Usually, if you look at how things are named, the oldest name is what they're really going by. This is a really low, shallow island. What you see on here is a few sycamores and some silver maples, and the total land surface of this area is probably not more than 3 to 5 feet above the river level at this stage right here. So there's not a lot of diversity there, just basically 2 or 3 species. None of the trees are very big. But in the 1855 map by Babbitt, they called it Middleton Island. So No Name Island really does have a name. It's called Middleton Island. So they're wrong. This is the town of Tionesta right here. This is Tionesta Creek flowing in. This is Lighthouse Island, which it was called Tionesta Island originally, but they built a massive lighthouse on it as a memorial for someone. Most of the island was also mined for gravel. And so you've got a flat, gravelly surface here and a big lighthouse up here, a few little patches of trees around the edges, nothing spectacular. The next island down, these were part of the Tionesta series of islands. We decided to call them refugee islands because back in the late 1700s, there was a series of Indian villages up and down this part of the river, 3 of them at least. They were basically refugees, Delaware Indian refugees that had fled from Philadelphia. They've been Christianized and fled over this way, and to keep from being conflicts with the settlers who were pushing them out. And so we decided to call these refugee islands because we had to give them some sort of designation for our report. These are predominated by silver maples and sycamores. Here's Crull again. Some nice tall silver maples on the uppermost of those islands. These ones don't have a whole lot of relief. Here's a Crull and a sycamore. A lot of brush. And aside from silver maples and sycamores, and a whole lot of other species. More silver maples on the second of the island down. And those are these islands that are right here. This is Beer's 1865 map. And these are a whole series of little islands there. We looked at some of them, but most of them didn't have much of anything. They're real shallow, not very relief. The next one down is Holmen Island. Now Holmen Island is the location of Kibbs Island Park Campground, which has been set up as a permanent camp. This was a cut around here that it partially silted in, and then road construction that basically completely cut it off. If you get floodwaters, it'll overflood the road and it'll become an island again, but for the most part it's now attached to the shore, and it's been heavily developed. It's been farmed before, and it's been developed by this camping facility, but you still get some impression of what the original tree population was like. Here's a sycamore, 17.8 feet in girth, 109 feet tall. Again, the sycamore had its top blown out by the storm, so it would have been much taller. But this is a seriously massive tree. And there's a bunch of them in this remnants left over in the campground area. This is just the biggest one right where you go in. Common hackberry, 8.4 feet in girth, 92.4 feet tall. So some nice hackberries there as well. This is within the campground proper. There's some bigger ones over near the edge. Dotted hawthorn. There's me and a clearly single stem dotted hawthorn. This is 33.9 feet tall, 5.5 feet in girth. The only reason it is very similar in numbers overall to the one on King Island, except it doesn't have as large of a crown spread. But it's a much more impressive one to look at with that big twisted stem. This is right by the one restroom area in the campground. What was going on here a while back? Reporter General William Irvine, agent of the state on the donation lands. Blah, blah, blah. From Oil Creek to Cushing, an old Indian town, is about 17 miles. The whole this way is barren and high mountains. This is between Franklin and Holmen Island we're talking about. Not fit for cultivation. Mountain passes so close on the river it's almost impassable, no means impractical. When the river is high, then travelers either on foot or horseback are obliged to ascend the mountain or proceed along the summit. At Cushing, there is a narrow bottom about 2 miles long, good land, and a very fine island, 50 or 60 acres. This is Holmen Island we're talking about, where Indians formerly planted corn. From Cushing, another old Indian town, also on the bank of the river, is about 6 miles. This is called Canary or Hickory Mountain. This is actually somewhere between East Hickory and Tionesta. And here's a few hundred acres of good land and some small islands. But people say, well, did the Indians actually cultivate these islands? Well, we have an account that Holmen Island at least was one that was cultivated. And individuals have told me that when they put in the golf course down there, that they excavated through an Indian village and buried it while they're putting the golf course down there by Holmen Island. So this is an actual historical account of farming on the islands by Indians. Again, this is a summary chart of all the different species we found, the maximum heights. Sycamore, 148.3, right by the tornado area on Baker Island, white ashes on Crull Island, silver maples on Thompson Island, eastern white pines on Crull Island, bare nut hickories on Coursen Island, cucumber tree that's on Hemlock Island. So these ones down here that say 5 are ones that we noted that were there but didn't actually measure, but I had to put some number in so it shows up in the chart. And I'm sure as we continue we'd find a greater diversity. There's 43 different species we've identified so far. Comparison of what we found in the Allegheny River Islands with what's the largest anywhere. Sycamore, Allegheny River Islands, Baker Island, 148. The tallest in Pennsylvania, 150.5 feet down in Greene County. It's a state park down there. The tallest in our database, 162.2 at Great Smoky Mountains National Park. White ash, 131.7, 167 Great Smoky Mountains. Acer saccharum, saccharinum. Silver maple, Thompson Island, that's the tallest we know in the country. Basswood, we've got basswood 113 in Crull Island, the tallest in the country is 128. Common hackberry gets up to 114. We found it 100 feet tall. Butternut used to be a really taller tree, but it's pretty much died off through much rain because of canker. They still got them 140 feet tall down in Great Smokies. Black willow, this is on Courson Island. They found one that's 102 feet tall up in Erie County. Probably Dale found it. I'm betting that we've got one at least over 90 on Hemlock Island. So we could be pushing this one. Crataegus punctata, dotted hawthorn. The tallest is at 44.4 feet on Crull Island. 45.4 is one of the Buckaloons sites. I think it's campsite 16. And the national champion dotted hawthorn is on King Island. Its national champion for American forest is 1 point for each foot of height, 1 point for each inch of girth, and 1/4 point for each foot of crown spread. And so you add those together to give a national champion. It's kind of arbitrary what values you assign those things, but that's just how they've been doing it. And that got me a national champion, so there. How do these sites compare to other places? The tallest site in eastern United States, average of the 10 tallest species, is 170 feet in the Great Smokies. Cook Forest, 138.31. Within Pennsylvania, you see Cook's Forest is 130. Well, this is 137.72. The Allegheny River from Crull Island to Holeman Island, 122. So within Pennsylvania, this stretch has the 16th tallest forest in the state. And there's the numbers for individual islands for comparison purposes. It's just a useful shorthand to look at how tall different types of forests are, to get some feeling where yours sits among the ranks of tall forests. You don't get a whole lot of tall specimens on the Allegheny River Islands. It's partly suppressed for 2 reasons. You have one species that grows really tall, the sycamore, and you get white ash, which grows fairly tall, 130 feet or so. And most of the rest of the stuff are species that just plain don't grow tall. There's a limited number of species present because the island's flooded, so you don't get a high diversity of species. You don't get a high diversity of tall species on the island. A summary of what we found on all the islands, species-wise. You can see some things like butternut and black willow are found everywhere. Some of them, like hemlock, was only found on one island. So, data summary. Meaningful at West Hickory, CFS. This blue line was before Kinzua Dam, and the red line was after Kinzua Dam. What you see is much enormously bigger floods in the spring and much higher water flows in the summer than was present prior to the construction of Kinzua Dam. And this affects the morphology of the river as well as the specimens grown there. This is from a 1936 book, Rivers of the United States. This is the Allegheny River one. The Allegheny River is never been classified as an excellent waterway of commerce. It's likely to be frozen solid from December until March, ice piled in great packs and jams perhaps at 30 localities, piled mountain high with great blocks thrown to the most jagged contortions by reason of grinding and pressure brought to bear. Then comes the annual spring thaw. It's a frightening spectacular to behold. Melting snow and drizzling rains, which riles all the creeks to flood tide and causes a never-ending roar from each gully and ravine. The river stirs uneasily first, winces, and flotsam and jetsam, trees, logs, houses, barns. All this hodgepodge starts moving to no thunderous cannonading of ice jams breaking. One jam swoops down upon the other with a continued crashing and rending the muddy discharges on the way. All summer long, with few notable historic exceptions, the Allegheny River is a big overgrown creek spilling out its contribution of crystal clear water to the Ohio River. The long, slender, rolling gravel bars come out for air. The catfish have to stand on their heads to get their gills wet. So, what happens when you build the dam? In general, the response include decreased magnitude floods in the morning, increased low flow. These induce alterations in channel morphology, reductions in downstream sediment transport, so the dirt is being hauled downstream like it was before. You get coalescing of islands merging into shores a lot more rapidly in these settings than you do prior to the dam construction. Areas that were formerly flooded, like that 1939 one from Crull's Island, which is a bare sandbar, that would be scoured every year. Well, once you start flooding it, those areas aren't going to be scoured, and you're going to get those vegetation take over and continue to grow. An overall increase in the number of sized islands have been found to take place after construction of large dams. A reasonable supposition would be that some of the near shore islands become attached to the riverbanks as floodplains and point bars absent the larger floods to interfere with the attachment process. The attachment process has at least been accelerated by the presence of the dam farther upstream. Some species, like the silver maple and sycamore, like to have that constant disturbance in order to propagate. You know, they need that bare area to propagate. What happens is you remove that bare area, you get less reproduction of silver maples and sycamores, and elsewhere you get increased numbers of species that are less flood tolerant. So you get a change in species composition. You get more maples, more like oaks and ashes and things that don't do as well in the floodwaters. And their numbers will increase over time. And the flood-dependent species like sycamores and silver maples will decrease over time. There's some question about whether there's any active or much active recruitment or regeneration of silver maples or sycamores within the islands at the present time. It's something we haven't really tried to address yet. This is what life's like out near Warren and Kitty these days. And the people going out for a nice Sunday afternoon boat ride.
Thank you, Ed.